Jesus told a story about two sons and their father. The two sons got lost in different ways. One went off to a distant country and there squandered the wealth that his father had given him in wild living. The other son got lost by staying home and not recognizing the possibilities of his father's abundance there in his father's house at his father's table. And we're going to talk about the first son, the one that went away, the one who said, "Father, give me the share of the inheritance now." We're going to talk about him today, and we're going to set the older son apart a little bit because we're living in the time where the world desperately needs the mercy of God, and this is a passage, a teaching that Jesus gave about God's mercy. It's a word for all of us who have sometimes wandered far from the Father's table and the Father's love, and it is this: come to God and live. I want to help us hear that in this morning. Now, it was the younger son who said, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And whether that son had the right to do it or not, to ask for that money, different Bible scholars say different things. But the point is this, that when the son asked, the father gave it to him. The father showed this tremendous act of generosity. He gave, and the father heard him. And even though he probably knew exactly what his son had in mind, he still gave him that tremendous, rich portion of his wealth. And it's this act of grace, this gift. And just we can see how powerful the ask is, how the father responds to that, how the father gives. And in this story, Jesus is gathered there at the table. It says he's among tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees are saying, "What's going on? How do you eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And he tells them 3 stories about being lost. This is the third of those stories about the lost sons. And the key verse is verse 13. It says, "Not long after that, after the son received his inheritance, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living." So, here's where we get a vision, a window into the character of that son. This is where we see what his heart really was, because he just before didn't have the money to carry out his dreams. He always had that same heart, that desire to go far from the Father's table. He just didn't have the money. This is what he always wanted. And this is a story about wants. It's a story about desire. Because this son desires the wild life. His desires, they're in the wrong place. He wanted something that seemed like the good and abundant life, but in fact ends up being a life of famine and hunger and death. And here's the thing, we're all in there with him at some point. We've all got to make choices. What do we want? What do we desire? And it's often our desires that are going to lead us in life. We go after what we want. Most of the time, it's really just that simple. We may do some things that we don't want to do, but usually those things, they're going to come back to what our deeper desires are. So maybe we don't like our job always, and we don't want to go to work, but we have a deeper desire to, say, put food on the table. So we go and we do that thing. But really, we follow our desires. We go where our heart leads us, where we want something. And we see this son who wants something very deeply that leads him in the wrong direction. And in this season of Lent, it's really a season of taking stock of the ways that our hearts can lead us astray, the ways that we want the wrong things or want the right things, but in the wrong way. This is a time where we see the son living that out, and we can be called back to the Father. Now, the scriptures say that he journeyed to a distant country. The King James Version has this wonderful line. It calls it the far country. I like that. It's the far country. But this is not a story about traveling. This is about leaving the Father to chase a dream that leads away from the Father. In the absence of the Father, the son finds the brokenness of the path that he's chosen. In the presence of the Father, there's wealth and grace and community and abundance, but the son doesn't see it. He succumbs to the allure of the far country. He dreams a dream that is not the Father's. It's glittering. It's a muscular dream. It's sleek and powerful, but it's all smoke, all stone, all cracked and broken. And the fantasy fades. Verse 14, if you're following along. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So this new land falls into and is in fact characterized by famine. It's a place of hunger. That's why the son went there, of course. He was hungry. He didn't know what he was hungry for or where that hunger would lead him, but he hungered. And the far country is not a place of peace and rest and satisfaction. It is a place where hunger begets hunger in a frantic spiral. And there he is in this hard place, caught up in the race to the bottom of the hog trough. He's sown the wind and he reaps the whirlwind. Verse 15. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And I think a little bit, I kind of like that song, Wizard of Oz, right? When they're going to the haunted forest, and it's also coming east out of Greensburg, Kansas, if you've ever noticed that. But Greensburg, Kansas, or the haunted forest, it says, I'd turn back if I were you, if you can see that. I'd turn back if I were you. And in this whole story, we want to just grab that son and be like, turn back. I'd turn back if I were you. We want to just shake him. He asks for the money from the father, and we want to just say to him, I'd turn back if I were you. When he journeys to that far country, we want to grab him and say, I'd turn back if I were you. When the coins burn a hole in his pocket, we want to say, I'd turn back if I were you. When the famine comes and the hunger rises like a slow tide, we want to say, turn back, there's still time, turn back. And verse 16 is the low moment in this story. In verse 16, we read that the son longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. Look at this. No one gave him anything. This is the low moment. The son has gotten what he always wanted, though he didn't know it. No one casts him out. No one judges him. No one has to punish him because the sin itself is the punishment. He did not want to eat from the Father's table, and so he doesn't. Instead, he's eating with the pigs. The son has exchanged pods for God. And it's all very undramatic. I mean, that's kind of how these things go. There's no step along the way that seemed too bad. The far country was not filled with evil and monsters. It was just far from the Father. There was no precipitous fall. There was no anything evil there. It was just one thing after another. The far country and the wildlife and the emptiness and the pigs. The hunger that drove the son was always with him. And there, hunched over that hog trough, there with the grunting and the shoving and the slop, he saw where that hunger really led. It wasn't rock bottom. Believe it or not, there is no rock bottom. We can always dig a little further. But it was a bottom. It was the place where finally, incredibly, the memory of his father's house came to him. A little graceful wind fluttered his hair, tickled his senses. There was no boom, no earth-shaking voice, no lightning strike to rattle his soul, no abyss. The son looked over the edge all right, but it was merely the edge of the hog trough. And then in verse 17 it says, he came to his senses. That's it. He came to his senses. No one told him. No one shook him out of it. No one swooped in to rescue him. He came to his senses. It was a grace so subtle that we could easily miss it. He remembered the Father's house. How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? He remembered the abundance that he had left, the love that he had known, and he set his will to return to the Father's table. This is verse 18. He says to himself, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. He says, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like your hired men. Verse 20, he gets up. And this is important because, Jesus' story that he tells here, this is not a story about getting lost, right? We call it the prodigal son, the lost son. But this is not a story about getting lost. Getting lost is not that special. People get lost all the time. Punch one thing wrong into your little GPS and you're going to be lost in the boonies somewhere. We get lost all the time. You know what I'm talking about. It's like those bumper stickers that say, don't follow me, I'm lost, right? Like that's pretty much the human condition. So a story about getting lost is not that special, but what makes this story amazing and interesting and special is that Jesus is telling a story about not just getting lost, but about getting found. It's a story about turning around. It's a story about coming home. It's lost and found again, dead and then alive. Jesus is telling a story about coming back. And the son rehearses what he will say to his father, right? We see this. He says in verses 18 and 19, that passage that we just looked at, I'll set out, I'll go back to my father. I'll say, I'm not worthy, right? He's thinking it through. It's kind of a little prayer. And he picks up that burden that's on his heart, that hunger that had led him down into the squish and squalor of his desire. And he lays that burden down. He just drops it. He lays it down. And this is the moment when the son realized that he's never going to find what he's looking for in the far country. It's not that the father wants to keep the son from having fun, wants him to live some kind of dull and boring life while everyone else is having a party. The father wants him to truly live. It's like he told the elder son, he says to him, all that is mine is yours. The son already has it all. He just doesn't realize it. And he thinks that the good and abundant life is going to be found out there somewhere. One more variation on wine, women, and song. But it's an illusion. None of it's real. It's all just a bunch of leftover pig pods. Real life is found at the Father's table. Verse 20. This is where we see the son get up and go to his father. And it's very interesting here. These words are chosen carefully. The word for getting up in Greek is the same word for resurrection. Anastas. He got up. He arose. Anastas. He was resurrected, and he went to his father. And the father recognizes just how significant this turn of events is because he says it twice. Look at this in verse 24 and then again in verse 32. Note what he says to the older son. This son of mine was dead. He knows this is a resurrection. This son of mine was dead, and now he is alive again. The son gets up and goes to the father. He was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, and now he's found. He was dead to his senses. He was dead to the right path. He was dead to his father's love, but now he's alive again. He was lost, but now he's been found. He's come home. Or at least he's started back. The distance between deciding to go and meeting the Father again, it doesn't seem like it's that great in this passage, but the reason it's not that great is because when the Father sees him, we all know what happens. When the Father sees him, he's still a long way off, and his Father runs and is filled with compassion and runs to his son, throws his arms around him, and kisses him. And we all know that those ancient fathers aren't supposed to run. We've all been told that to run to this wayward son breaks all kinds of decorum, but I'm not so sure. I mean, sometimes we repeat things. If we would just know our Apocrypha a little bit, we'd know that aged Anna in the book of Tobit, when her son Tobias comes back, she throws down what she's doing and she runs to him. And Tobias was no prodigal, but there she was, Anna, running, this righteous matron, embracing her traveler son. But here it is, the father saw him and was filled with compassion. And if the son's heart was moved by an unnamed and destructive hunger, then the father's heart was moved by compassion. This was always the father's heart, turns out. Compassion. It was the father's love that gave that gift to the son. It was the father's love that released the son out onto his terrible journey. It was the father's compassionate heart that led him to watch and to wait. And then when he saw his son coming, to run, to embrace him. As the band Rend Collective sings in one of their songs, a second chance is heaven's heart. In verse 21, the son, he says that speech that he had rehearsed so many times on the way home, but he doesn't get what he expected. Verses 22 through 24. The father says, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him." He tells that to his servants. "Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And so they began to what? Did they begin to tear him down, begin to judge him, begin to destroy him, begin to kick him out? They begin to celebrate. It's a totally radical turn of events, not what we expect. It's an act of sheer grace. It's this turnaround. This boy, this son, deserves the cold shoulder. He deserves the door slammed in his face. He deserves to have the father's hired men come and cast him out on his duff. But no. Give him robes, give him rings, give him feasts. Put some fresh sandals on this boy's worn feet. Welcome him and embrace him and bring him and sit him down. This son of mine was dead and alive again. He was lost and is found. Why? I mean, the older son comes along to teach us all a lesson in justice. We know what should have happened here. We all know how this should have gone, but didn't. Because of the Father's love. You see, there are a lot of stories out there about getting lost. Those are a dime a dozen. But it is the Father's love that makes this story different. It is the Father's compassionate heart, his mercy, that turns this story on its head. The prayer that the Son voices is, Father, let me be like one of your hired hands. That's what he says to himself all the way home. Father, just let me be like one of your hired hands. But his true prayer, I think, was, Father, run to me. Please, Father, run to me. I think that's the true prayer of all of our hearts. Father, run to me. It's what James promised would happen when he told us that if we draw near to God, then he will draw near to you. It's the turnaround that happens at the cross. And there we all are at some point, lost in that far country, a long ways from the Father's table, up to our ears in pig pods. I'd turn back if I were you. And that's what the Father desires, that turning back. Job 33:30 says that God longs to turn back people's souls from the pit, that the light of life might shine on them. The Father desires us to turn back. So where are you on that journey? And remember, this is not a one-time thing. I mean, we can be one day dining at the Father's table and the next getting our passports stamped in the far country. Where are you? Do you need to turn back to yourself? Do you need to come to yourself and turn back? Are you praying that the Father might run to you again? And you know, this can seem like an impossible thing because sometimes we can find ourselves so deep in that far country that we can have trouble even believing in the Father's compassionate heart. Our capacity to believe in the Father's mercy is going to be the first thing to go. It goes right out the window. We end up believing that the world is all rock and stone, all smoke and blood, and that the mercy was squeezed out of it long ago. But the Father is watching for our return. He's waiting to run for us. Saint Benedict, the man who long ago gathered monks together, men who committed their lives to constant prayer, Saint Benedict wrote an order, a life of monks called the Rule of Saint Benedict. He didn't call himself Saint Benedict, he just called it his rule. But it's called the Rule of Saint Benedict. One of his rules for the monks was this: never lose hope in God's mercy. That's one of his rules. So among the other rules, like about how you're going to live together and how you run your monastery, this rule, never lose hope in God's mercy. I like that. I think someone needs to get one of those signs, those milk paint signs, and paint that on there. Never lose hope in God's mercy, because this is the thing. Whatever far country we're in, God's mercy can find us there. It's because of God's mercy that we can still turn back. No matter how lost we are, we can still turn back to God. A man named Abraham Ye Nial, who was a survivor of the civil war in Sudan. His name's Abraham. He ended up becoming a refugee in Africa, along with many thousands of other young people, young boys. You may have heard of them. They were called the Lost Boys of Sudan. Have you heard of that? And so Abraham was wandering across Africa looking for a safe place to live. And many of the kids that were walking around, their parents had been killed or gone missing. They were looking for a safe place to live, getting attacked by bandits and alligators and lions. And some of them found their way to the United States, including this Abraham. They were received as refugees, and he grew up, became a leader in his church, and said this: "I have been called a lost boy, but I'm not lost from God." You know, no matter where you're at on your journey, no matter how deep into the far country, you are not lost from God. God reminded Israel of this through his prophets. When their nation had been razed by the Babylonians, when their temple was destroyed, when their people were scattered, in that far country of Babylon, God spoke to them and said, "O Israel, do not fear. For I've redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. And when Babylon's 70 years are completed, will I visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. And I will lead the blind by a road they do not know. By paths they have not known, I will guide. I will turn the darkness before them into light, the rough places into level ground. These are the things I will do, and I will not forsake them." In other words, the prophets were telling the people, never lose hope in God's mercy. God promised that he would make that road possible for them, that, as one writer puts it, they wouldn't have to go all the way back on their own because he would run to them. He would meet them. He would welcome them. That was their mercy road. So where are you at on that journey? Sometimes, like the son lost in the far country, we have to lay down our pods and turn back. We have to give up on our aspirations of living life without God, on figuring it out on our own. We have to lay down our burdens, our mistakes, our hatreds, our grumblings, our prejudices. We have to stop hanging on so tightly to the stones that weigh us down and turn back to the Father. What burden do you have to lay down so that you can come to God and live? There's a path that leads to the Father's table. It's open to all of us. Can we turn from all those things that do not give us life, all those burdens that weigh down our heart? Can we believe in the Father's mercy afresh? I'd turn back if I were you.